What if everything you thought you knew about the royal family, its rituals, its traditions, its secrets locked behind palace walls, was suddenly flipped upside down by a single sentence written by the Queen herself? And what if that sentence, spoken aloud by Princess and in a room filled with tension thick enough to slice, left Prince Harry and Meghan Markle sitting in stunned silence, unable to process what had just been revealed? Because what happened next wasn't just unexpected. It was unprecedented, and it triggered a ripple that is still shaking the House of Windsor in ways the public hasn't even begun to understand. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. That's where we begin. Picture it: a quiet, heavily guarded room inside Windsor Castle. Curtains drawn. A handful of senior royals seated around an antique oak table that had witnessed more secrets than any living monarch could count. The atmosphere? Suffocating. The stakes? Higher than anyone could admit out loud. Because hidden inside the Queen's final will was something no one outside her closest circle even knew existed. A confidential family archive. A sealed, meticulously curated collection of letters, recordings, handwritten diaries, private messages, directives, warnings, and royal reflections spanning decades. And instead of being passed down to all her children and grandchildren as tradition might suggest, this archive, this massively powerful treasure trove, was left to only one person, Prince William. And that's exactly where the shock began. But before we get there, let's step back. Let's ask the question every viewer watching right now is secretly thinking. Why would the Queen exclude Harry, her grandson who once stood proudly alongside William? Why would she create an emotional divide so deep that even seasoned royal advisors flinched hearing Princess and read the line? And what exactly is inside this archive that made the Queen so deliberate, so cautious, so fiercely protective about who received it? Because make no mistake, this wasn't an accident. This wasn't a small detail. This wasn't one of those quiet ceremonial quirks that just sort of happens. This was intentional, calculated, a message and a warning wrapped into one. And if you think Harry didn't feel every ounce of that message in real time, think again. Let's start with the moment the reading began. Princess and sat stiffly, the leather-bound folder resting in her hands like a live wire. She wasn't nervous, and doesn't do nervous. She was guarded, controlled, her jaw set with the same steeliness she showed during decades of royal service. But there was something else there too, something no one expected from her. A hint of hesitation, a flicker of reluctance? Or was it regret? Hard to say, because what she was about to read wasn't simply the distribution of estates or titles or ceremonial responsibilities. It was the Queen's final tone-setting act, her last effort to hold her family together, or split it apart for strategic reasons only she understood. Now imagine this: Harry leaning in slightly, trying, and failing, to pretend he wasn't anxious. Meghan sitting beside him, back straight, chin angled, eyes scanning the room for social cues, calculating every breath, every shift, every micro-expression of the royals sitting opposite her. William seated calmly, hands folded, his demeanor almost immovable. Not cold, not arrogant, but grounded, as if deep down, he already suspected what was coming. And then Princess and began reading. At first, it was standard, traditional, predictable. The kind of royal formalities that every monarch includes in their final will. Mentions of estates, personal possessions, jewelry allocations, charitable endowments, ceremonial instructions, familiar sentiments written with the Queen's unmistakable poise and precision. But then, halfway down the page, Princess and paused. A long pause. One long enough that everyone in the room lifted their heads. One long enough that even the senior advisors holding clipboards noticed the air shift. One long enough that Meghan's lips tightened ever so slightly, and Harry's fingers froze. Princess and looked up. Her eyes scanned the room once, twice, almost as if she were asking herself whether to continue. And then, in her firm, unmistakably steady voice, she read the line. A line that instantly changed the temperature of the room. A line that cracked the foundation of Harry's expectations. A line that made Meghan's carefully maintained expression flicker for the briefest moment. Because here it was. The Queen had left her confidential family archive, the most sensitive, guarded, secret collection of royal history, to Prince William alone. Not to the heirs collectively. Not to the family as a whole. Not split between her grandchildren. Only William. And before Harry could even process what that meant, and continued. The Queen's instructions stated that the archive is to be entrusted solely to the direct heir who will one day become king. A line that instantly clarified one thing, and one thing only. It would never be Harry. But that wasn't even the worst part. Because the Queen didn't just assign responsibility. She also included a reason. A reason that Princess and had to read out loud, while Harry and Meghan sat there listening, powerless to stop it. Now you might be wondering, what exactly is inside this archive that's so dangerous, so explosive, so meticulously protected that the Queen could only trust one person, William? With its contents? Let's talk about that. Imagine decades worth of unfiltered reflections. Notes about family scandals the public still debates today. Personal thoughts about royal alliances, fractured relationships, political crises, historic conflicts, succession concerns, and deeply private commentary on the roles and behaviors of her children and grandchildren. Yes, roles and behaviors. Meaning Harry's name appears inside the archive. Meghan's too. But he will never be allowed to read any of it. And here's the question the audience needs to consider. If the Queen was willing to give William access to the full story, the full truth, the full hidden record of the royal family, what does that imply about her trust? Her judgment? Her final view of how the monarchy must survive? Let's dig even deeper. Harry wasn't just excluded from the archive. He was intentionally removed from the chain of those with access. Traditionally, private documents of this magnitude would be offered to multiple heirs or kept within a secure family vault. But not this time. This time, the Queen took a route so unprecedented that even long-standing advisors reportedly blinked in shock. And if you think Meghan didn't see the PR implications of this moment instantly, of course she did. Her mind moved quickly. What does this mean for the Sussex brand? How does this affect their narrative, their storytelling, their media projects, their future positioning? Because being excluded from the royal inner circle in such a definitive way wasn't just a blow to Harry, Meghan felt it too. And in that moment, with the room so quiet you could hear the soft ticking of a wall clock, they both realized something harsh but undeniable. The Queen had made her final judgment. A judgment they could not spin, could not challenge, could not reinterpret. And yet, there was more. Because Princess Anne hadn't reached the end of the passage yet. She hadn't delivered the line that carried the true emotional punch. She hadn't gotten to the part that explained, not directly, but through elegant royal implication, why the Queen made this choice. And that explanation would reshape the entire narrative of Harry's place in the royal family. But before she reached that line, the room shifted again. People leaned in, breaths held. Meghan's eyes narrowed slightly. Harry's foot started tapping under the table. William's expression remained calm. Too calm, some might say, as if he were bracing himself for yet another responsibility he never asked for but always knew would come. Princess Anne turned the page. And here's the thing. This wasn't just another page. This was the page. The one the advisors had whispered about. The one the Queen had annotated in her own handwriting. The one sealed inside an envelope marked with a private crest no one had seen used in decades. And as Anne unfolded that paper, the entire table stilled. Now, ask yourself, what kind of revelation could be so powerful, so sensitive, so deeply personal that the Queen, who guarded her privacy like a fortress, would leave written instructions to limit its access to a single heir? What kind of information would she deem dangerous in the wrong hands? What kind of entries might reshape how the monarchy is perceived? And most importantly, what did she believe Harry would do with that information if he ever gained access to it? These are the undercurrents that define the moment. Not the words alone, but the emotions swirling beneath them. Fear, anticipation, defensiveness, legacy, loyalty, betrayal. All compressed into one small room with 4 senior royals and an envelope holding the Queen's unfiltered truth. But here's where things take an even darker turn. Because as Princess Anne began reading the Queen's handwritten justification, what followed didn't just silence Harry. It stunned him. Contradictions unfolded. Emotions clashed. A story beneath the story emerged. A story that the public never heard. A story that explained the Queen's fears, not of Harry's intentions, but of the influence he had allowed into his life. And that influence sat right beside him. You know where this is heading. Because the Queen didn't simply choose William. She chose stability over risk, duty over unpredictability, and preservation over exposure. And Harry understood that instantly. But the real blow? That was still ahead. Because the Queen's reasoning didn't end with Harry. It extended to Meghan. And when Princess Anne reached that line, the entire room shifted. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Where do you go from a revelation that cracks the room in half? How do you breathe? How do you blink? How do you even sit still after hearing that the Queen, the woman who shaped the monarchy like no other in modern history, left behind a secret so explosive that even Princess Anne hesitated before reading it aloud? That's exactly where Chapter 1 begins, in the thick of the shock, inside a room charged with tension, disbelief, and something far more dangerous than anger. Let me ask you something. Have you ever been in a room where the air feels heavy? Where everyone knows something just went wrong, but nobody wants to speak first? That was the atmosphere the moment Princess Anne lowered her gaze after announcing that Prince William, and William alone, would inherit the Queen's confidential family archive. No one exhaled. No one shifted. No one dared to break the silence. It was as if time itself paused just to watch what would unfold next. Now imagine yourself as a silent observer, standing just behind that table, watching everything from the shadows. You can feel the tension bleeding off the polished wood. You can see Harry's eyes widen, his posture stiffening. Meghan's fingers tightening subtly against her lap. William's jaw tightening, not out of triumph, but out of the crushing weight of yet another royal burden handed to him. And Anne, she remained poised and still, as if braced for impact. Because the next few seconds were crucial, Harry blinked first. A small, almost imperceptible movement, but enough to reveal what was happening beneath the surface. He wasn't angry yet. That would come later. He wasn't humiliated yet. That emotion was building quietly in the background. What he felt in that instant was disbelief. A kind of internal collapse that said, wait, no, that can't be it. There must be more. There must be something for me. And that's where this chapter truly begins. Because Harry wasn't just reacting to a legal detail or a ceremonial choice. He was reacting to an emotional uprooting, a severing, a verdict that echoed louder than anything written on paper. Let's rewind to the exact moment and resumed reading. Her voice, steady, low, unwavering, filled the room again. She was trained for this. Royal protocol was her backbone. Duty was her guide. But even she couldn't hide the softness that slipped into her tone. Almost as if she wished the words didn't have to be spoken aloud. The confidential family archive shall be entrusted to the direct heir, she read. For the preservation of institutional memory, for the protection of state integrity, and for the safeguarding of the monarchy's internal continuity. A formal line, yes. But the message beneath it was razor sharp. It wasn't about favor or affection. It was about trust. And trust, in this context, meant reliability, stability, predictability, loyalty to duty over self. Suddenly, the puzzle pieces started snapping into place around the table. William wasn't being rewarded. He was being prepared, trained, armed with knowledge and history that only a future monarch could carry. And Harry? The realization washed over him like an icy wave. He wasn't a future monarch. Not anymore. Not in any version of the world the Queen envisioned. Not after everything that had happened. Now let me ask you, can you imagine what that feels like? To be seated in a room where you used to belong unquestionably, only to discover that the ground beneath you has shifted permanently, quietly, irrevocably? Harry could, and Meghan sensed it too. Her eyes darted, not wildly, not frantically, but sharply, calculatingly, from and to William to Harry. She wasn't reading words. She was reading reactions. She was gauging power, influence, optics. Because Meghan understood something critical about the royal world, even if she outwardly rejected it. Information is power. Narratives are currency. And archives, private, royal, historical archives, are nuclear weapons. So imagine what it means to be cut out of one. Harry inhaled deeply, slow, controlled, but the tremor in his chest betrayed him. This wasn't a blow he expected. Not like this, not so public, not so final. He had anticipated tension, maybe distance, maybe even a symbolic gesture that favored William. But a full exclusion? A direct line in the Queen's final will stating that the most sacred collection in the royal family would bypass him entirely? That hit different. Now let's shift the lens. Let's talk about the room itself, because the setting here matters more than you might think. The Queen chose Windsor Castle for the reading. Not Buckingham Palace. Not Balmoral. Not Sandringham. Windsor was symbolic. It was the heart of her late-life routine, the place she found comfort, the place she felt closest to her own history. And she wanted her final wishes spoken there, quietly, ceremonially, privately. The room was small compared to the grand halls the public imagines. This wasn't a room meant for pomp. This was one meant for truth. The walls were lined with bookshelves, each filled with leather-bound volumes of royal correspondence. A portrait of Queen Victoria gazed down from above the fireplace, almost as if she were watching the next generation navigate the same fragile institution she once ruled with iron composure. The table was long, but not too long. Close enough for everyone to hear each other breathe. Close enough for the tremors in Harry's hands to be noticed by anyone paying attention. Princess, and continued reading. And with each sentence, the emotional temperature shifted, quietly, subtly, dangerously. Because and wasn't just reading a will. She was reading consequences. The contents of the archive, she continued, contain sensitive materials that reflect the private considerations, judgments, and experiences of the monarchy over many decades. Sensitive, private, judgments. Each word was slicing through the silence with surgical precision. And here's the contradiction, the irony that hung in the air like smoke. Harry had always believed he was closest to the Queen emotionally, that he had a bond no one could take away. But the Queen wasn't leaving behind an emotional inheritance. She was leaving behind a structural one, a monarchy-sized inheritance. And those two worlds, emotional closeness and institutional trust, do not always overlap. This chapter is about that collision. Let's take a closer look at Harry's thought process, because this is where the real emotional unraveling begins. In his mind, he replayed memories, smiling beside the Queen at royal events. Her affectionate comments about his humor, his childhood summers at Balmoral, her quiet support during his military years, her warmth at his wedding. So how could she exclude him from something so significant? But here's the part Harry had failed to understand. Until that exact moment, the archive wasn't about closeness. It wasn't about love. It was about preserving the monarchy, not nurturing the family. And the Queen, perhaps more than any monarch before her, understood the distinction. Now shift the focus to Meghan, because her emotional arc during this chapter is just as critical. She didn't gasp. She didn't flinch. She didn't frown. Meghan's strength, her greatest survival skill, has always been her ability to maintain composure when the narrative shifts against her. But internally, her thoughts were racing, faster than anyone else's in the room, because she understood something Harry did not. Being excluded from the archive wasn't merely symbolic. It was strategic. It was protective. It was a statement that the Queen did not fully trust how information might be handled once it passed outside royal walls. Meghan knew the implication before Harry did, and that's why she shot a quick glance at him, almost imperceptibly, almost like she knew he wasn't putting it together yet. Now let's talk about William, because his reaction is perhaps the most interesting of all. Most people assume he'd look triumphant, victorious, chosen. But that wasn't his expression at all. If anything, he looked burdened, weighted, as if inheriting the archive wasn't a gift, but a responsibility he'd been preparing for his entire life, but still dreaded deep down. And that tells you something critical about the difference between Harry and William. Harry thinks emotionally. William thinks institutionally. Harry sees family. William sees duty. Harry looks for connection. William looks for continuity. And those differences, those deep, baked-in differences, are exactly why the Queen made the decision she did. Let's move deeper into the tension now, because this is where the contradictions start intensifying. Princess and reached the part of the will that described the archive's contents in greater detail. Not specifics, because specifics were too explosive to put on paper, but categories. The archive includes, and read, private correspondence between monarchs, personal reflections on matters of state, unredacted accounts of family events, and confidential records of crises affecting the crown. Did you catch that? Unredacted accounts of family events. That was the line that made Meghan's eyes widen. Not dramatically, Just slightly. But enough. She knew what that meant. There were things in the Queen's possession that had never been discussed publicly. Moments never clarified. Decisions never explained. Conflicts never exposed. And the thought of William having full access to those unfiltered records? That was a threat. A threat to narrative control. A threat to revision. A threat to public perception. And Meghan? Meghan lives and breathes narrative. Now here's where the chapter reaches its emotional breaking point. Princess and placed the page down slowly. Deliberately. She looked up, first at William, then at Harry. The Queen believed, she said, that the archive must remain with the heir who demonstrates steadfast commitment to the institution and its legacy. Steadfast commitment. That line hit Harry like a punch to the ribs. Because what was he in the Queen's eyes? Uncommitted? Unstable? Unpredictable? But before Harry could fully absorb the meaning, and continued. And this next sentence was the one that broke him. The Queen entrusted the archive to the individual she believed would honor its integrity and maintain its confidentiality. Confidentiality. That's when Harry's face changed. That's when he understood. And as the realization washed over him, Meghan's expression hardened just a fraction and closed the folder. But it wasn't over. Not even close. Because there was one more envelope. A smaller one. One sealed with a crest Harry had never seen. And it was addressed to him. And lifted it slowly. And that, right there, is where everything shifted again. Because if the archive was given to William, then what was inside the envelope meant for Harry. And why didn't it look sad? Why would the Queen create an archive so secret, so tightly controlled, that even senior royals didn't know the full extent of its contents? What kind of memories, documents, and confessions require protection across generations? Before we can understand the devastation Harry felt, and the icy clarity William absorbed, we need to go back. Far back. Because the story of the confidential family archive didn't begin with Queen Elizabeth II. It began decades before her reign, during moments of crisis, scandal, and survival that shaped the monarchy into the fragile powerhouse it is today. The archive is not just a box of letters. It is a fortress of memory, a vault of truth, a map of mistakes. And the Queen didn't just inherit it. She expanded it, protected it, and ultimately weaponized it. And when Princess Anne read that section of the will, a part of the royal family's history revived itself like a ghost rising from a sealed tomb. The origins trace back to King George V, who understood something vital about the monarchy's future. The world was changing. The press was growing teeth. Politicians were growing bolder. Public opinion was growing louder. So after a series of political missteps by his relatives, plus a handful of scandals that never reached the newspapers, he began collecting private letters, diary entries, and handwritten reflections to document the truth behind decisions that might one day be questioned. It wasn't formal at first, just fragments. Little notes explaining why he approved certain policies, why he protected certain relatives, why he exiled others. But over time, those pieces accumulated into a personal archive meant not to glorify the crown, but to protect it from being misunderstood, misrepresented, or manipulated by future generations. When King George VI ascended the throne, thrust into duty after the abdication crisis, he added his own layers. Imagine the weight he carried, a stammering monarch forced to lead Britain through war, propaganda, fear, and the collapse of empires. His diaries became darker, more reflective, more cautious. He wrote about the emotional toll of war speeches, about his private doubts, about the psychological battles he fought to appear strong. He wrote about Edward VIII, not as a brother, but as a warning. His reflections on the abdication crisis were reportedly brutal, honest, and cutting, detailing how the monarchy barely survived being torn apart by love, rebellion, and media hysteria. Those entries alone could devastate the modern royal image if ever made public. And they became part of the secret archive. The Queen inherited all of it when she was 25 years old. A young woman who didn't expect to rule so soon, suddenly handed a vault filled with the unedited truth about her family. Every scandal, every betrayal, every fracture, every lesson carved out of decades of turbulence. And she didn't just store it, she shaped it. She added her own layers of insight, caution, and emotional intelligence. She chronicled the complexities of raising a family inside an institution. She wrote about Charles and Diana, entries that historians would kill to read. She documented her reactions to the Windsor fire, to Margaret's controversies, to Andrew's decisions, to the deaths of loved ones, to the shifting world outside palace walls. But here's the twist no one expected. The Queen wrote not only about major events, but about people, family members, their patterns, their reliability, their weaknesses, their loyalty, their impulses, their marriages, their divorces, their choices, their relationships with the press. And some of those reflections, written calmly, privately, away from public influence, were likely the very reason Harry was excluded. Because the archive doesn't only preserve royal history. It interprets it, it evaluates it, it judges it, and sometimes it warns against it. Now imagine this. The Queen had decades to observe her children and grandchildren. She watched Charles navigate scandal after scandal. She watched Andrew spiral. She watched Anne's unwavering loyalty. She watched William grow from an anxious teenager into a steady, disciplined future king. And she watched Harry evolve, sometimes with pride, sometimes with concern, sometimes with heartbreak. She saw his charm, his warmth, his humor. But she also saw his volatility, his impulsiveness, his emotional vulnerability, his resentment toward the press, his longing for validation, and his increasing distance from royal duty. And when Meghan entered the picture, the Queen gave her the same careful observational patience she gave everyone else who stepped into the royal sphere. The Queen understood human behavior better than any psychologist or profiler, because she spent her life watching it unfold under pressure. So what happens when a monarch with that level of insight decides who should inherit the archive? What happens when she considers who can handle raw, unfiltered truth without using it for personal battles? What happens when she watches Harry and Meghan step into a global spotlight, criticize the institution, reveal internal conversations, and build careers around their own versions of royal events? The Queen didn't need anger to make her decision. She needed clarity. And the clarity came from history. Let me paint a picture of how the archive was physically protected. It wasn't sitting in a dusty basement or a cluttered storage room. It was housed in a temperature-controlled chamber within Windsor Castle, accessible only through a biometric lock added during the Queen's modernizing years. A handful of archivists knew the archive existed, but not what was inside. Two key custodians, appointed by the Queen, maintained the catalog. The royal librarian oversaw the preservation, but even they weren't permitted to read most of the documents. The Queen kept a smaller, secondary case inside her private apartments. This case, known informally among trusted staff as the Blue Box, contained her most personal documents, the ones she revisited often, updated, annotated, and protected fiercely. William had seen the Blue Box before, not opened, but carried. He once accompanied the Queen to an archive preservation room to observe the Crown's historical record system. At the time, he thought it was a lesson in royal duty. He didn't realize it was preparation. Harry had never received such moments. He wasn't groomed for safeguarding history. He was groomed for supporting roles, not central ones. Now let's dive even deeper into the psychology behind the archive's significance. The Queen believed the monarch should be the custodian of truth. Not the press, not biographers, not politicians, not historians. The monarch must know everything. Because how can a future king survive the weight of public scrutiny if he doesn't first understand the scars beneath the surface? The archive was built to be a private throne of knowledge, a place where truth lived without filters, and the Queen added entries during some of the most tumultuous moments of her life. Her response to the Diana interview, her private feelings during the Charles, Camilla scandal, her agony during the aftermath of Diana's death, her unease about certain marriages, her frustrations with palace politics, her worries about modern royal image, her fear during major security threats, her personal reflections after conversations with world leaders, and her heartbreak over grandchildren drifting away from duty. Yes, there are likely entries about Meghan, and not empty, gossipy notes. We're talking about observations from someone who spent 70 years reading people with precision. The Queen was kind, but she was not naive. She could spot manipulation, instability, or emotional fragility instantly. She could see patterns repeating across generations. She could see which marriages brought stability and which brought chaos. She could see which family members protected the crown and which jeopardized it. So when she structured her will in her final years, she didn't distribute items based on sentiment. She distributed them based on strategy. And this is where Harry's exclusion becomes painfully clear. The Queen respected Harry, loved him deeply, felt protective of him, but she did not fully trust him with the monarchy's most sensitive truths. Not after he stepped back from duty, not after he challenged the institution publicly, and not after he demonstrated emotional reactivity that could jeopardize the archive's purpose. If Harry had unrestricted access to unfiltered historical records, especially those involving Diana, Charles, Camilla, William, Andrew, and Meghan, the risk wasn't just emotional. It was geopolitical. One leak, one misinterpretation, one PR retaliation, one public feud, and decades of monarchy stability could crumble. But here's the twist that hits the hardest. The Queen didn't just exclude Harry because she feared what he might do. She excluded him because she feared how he might be influenced. She saw the dynamic. She saw the patterns. She saw the press alliances. She saw the media ambitions. She saw the shift in loyalty, not necessarily out of malice, but out of emotional displacement. And so she made her choice. The archive would go to William. The steady heir, the grounded one, the one who would never use the past as a weapon or a defense. And Harry would receive something else. Something deeply personal, intended only for him. Something that wasn't meant to hold power, but meaning. And that envelope was now sitting on the table. You can imagine the tension, the silence, the weight of every unspoken thought. Because the moment and lifted that small envelope, sealed with a crest that hadn't been used since the Queen Mother's time. Harry's stomach dropped. Meghan glanced at it with curiosity she tried to hide. William shifted slightly, sensing that whatever was inside would hurt Harry even more than the archive decision. Princess, and held the envelope firmly. This, she said quietly, was the Queen's final personal message to you. To Harry. Only Harry. And as she placed it gently in front of him, one question filled the room. What truth had the Queen left him that she couldn't trust anyone else to read? Princess, and has always been the monarchy's quiet storm. Unmoving, unshakable, unbothered by public opinion, and unflinchingly loyal to the institution she was born into. But few people truly understand the force she becomes inside the private walls of the royal family. And even fewer realize that when Queen Elizabeth II needed someone to carry out her most sensitive, most emotionally loaded, and most politically dangerous instructions, she didn't turn to Charles. She didn't turn to Edward. She didn't even turn to trusted advisors. She turned to Anne. Because when the Queen required a messenger who would never flinch, never sugarcoat, never soften the blow for the sake of comfort, and absolutely never let emotion override protocol, there was only one person on the entire planet capable of delivering that truth exactly as written. That person was Princess Anne. And that is why she was the one holding the Queen's leather-bound folder when the moment of reckoning finally arrived. To understand Anne's presence in that room, to understand why Harry and Meghan began to panic the second she paused, why William straightened his spine almost reflexively, and why the tension thickened around the table like wet cement, you need to understand the role Anne has played for decades. While her brothers stumbled through scandals, distractions, divorces, affairs, excuses, and PR catastrophes, and built a reputation for being the most consistent, most grounded, most indestructible royal in modern history. She never wanted the spotlight, but the spotlight eventually learned to respect her. She never chased titles, but titles attached themselves to her. She's the royal who survived kidnappings, press stalking, military-style schedules, brutal tabloids, and endless royal duties. Without ever complaining, breaking down, or exploding publicly. She was the Queen's shield, the Queen's anchor, the one who kept tradition from falling apart when the monarchy endured its darkest years, and never needed applause. She needed purpose, and the Queen knew this better than anyone. So when the Queen made her final arrangements, she included a line that wasn't part of the legal will, but part of the private instruction packet. The reading of the confidential family archive section must be done by Princess, and no substitute allowed. Why? Anne? Because the Queen understood that this moment would be explosive, emotional, and politically sensitive. She understood that the room would shake. And she also understood that Harry and Meghan would attempt to read tone, exploit hesitation, or take advantage of any softness or nervousness, and would give them nothing. She would be a stone wall, a fortress, a truth-teller who would deliver the Queen's decisions without trembling hands, without apologetic pauses, and without fear of backlash. This is why the room froze when and paused, not because she was showing weakness, but because she was the last person on earth who would pause unless the moment required absolute precision. Think about that. If and paused, something monumental was coming. Now imagine her sitting there, straight-backed, her posture as precise as a soldier on duty. Her eyes narrowed, not out of anger, but out of commitment. Her fingers resting calmly on the folder, as if grounding herself before delivering a sentence that would alter the royal family's internal hierarchy forever. That's the energy she brought into the room: quiet authority, iron professionalism, a command presence that doesn't scream. It simply exists, and everyone feels it. This is what Harry miscalculated, because Harry still viewed, and through the nostalgic haze of childhood, the aunt who was strict, blunt, mildly intimidating, and sometimes distant. He never fully understood the power she wielded behind the scenes. Meghan viewed indifferently. Meghan saw, and as an obstacle, a barrier, a guardian of protocol who didn't play games or tolerate theatrics, and represented everything Meghan couldn't influence, charm, or control. And that terrified her. So when and began to read the Queen's message, both Harry and Meghan braced themselves. Not because the words were harsh, but because the woman speaking them was incapable of manipulation. Anne's voice was the one voice Meghan knew would reveal the truth, whether it was flattering or brutally painful. Let's explore why Anne is so feared within palace walls. First, Anne has no patience for frivolity. She doesn't care about narrative battles, tabloid wars, emotional theatrics, or public sympathy. She cares about efficiency, duty, and the survival of the institution. She is what every politician claims to be, but never is: unimpeachably principled. She tells the truth, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts. Second, and has seen more royal disasters than any other living royal except the Queen herself. She watched the collapse of Charles and Diana's marriage from inside the family. She watched Andrew self-destruct in slow motion. She watched the press devour Sarah Ferguson. She watched the monarchy nearly crumble after Diana's death. She watched Camilla's transformation from national scandal to national asset. She watched Harry's resentment grow. She watched Meghan's entrance shift dynamics in ways no one could have predicted. Through all of it, she never made excuses. She simply adjusted the sails and kept moving. And third, the Queen trusted Anne's judgment more than anyone else's, more than Charles's, more than William's, and was the one who could distinguish emotion from motive, sincerity from manipulation, loyalty from self-interest. If Anne said something was risky, the Queen listened. If Anne said someone was trustworthy, the Queen believed her. If Anne warned that certain information must remain contained, the Queen locked it down. That is why Anne was the perfect person to reveal the archive decision. Now let's go back to the room, because the emotional electricity in the air is the centerpiece of this entire chapter. Anne lifted her eyes from the page slowly, deliberately. William felt the shift first. After all, he had grown up watching and deliver bad news with the same calm firmness she used to deliver good news. Harry noticed next, not because he understood in the way William did, but because he recognized the gravity of her expression. Meghan, however, recognized something deeper. She recognized strategic certainty. She recognized a decision that could not be appealed or softened. That's when her posture changed, barely, but noticeably. Her shoulders pulled back. Her expression tightened. Her gaze became more calculating. Meghan wasn't preparing for grief. She was preparing for damage control. Then Anne read the line: William alone would inherit the Queen's archive. Let's talk about Anne's internal reaction, because it's far more complex than the public would ever assume. She didn't relish delivering the news. She didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel vindicated. She felt protective. She felt responsible. She felt like the Queen had entrusted her with a final mission, and Anne always completes her missions. There was a flicker of sadness in her eyes, not because she disagreed with the Queen's decision, but because she understood how deeply this would wound Harry. She had watched Harry grow up. She had stood beside him at family events. She had witnessed his pain after Diana's death. She had seen the cracks appear long before he did. She knew this moment would break something inside him that could never be fixed. But she still read the line. Because that's what it does. She fulfills the crown's instructions, even when they shatter hearts. Now let's step into Anne's internal reasoning. The unspoken logic behind why she supported the Queen's decision, and saw instability where others saw vulnerability. She saw emotional impulsiveness where others saw sincerity. She saw a desire for independence that clashed with the demands of royal continuity. She saw Meghan's ambition, her sharpness, her media instincts, and knew instantly that giving the archive to Harry risked placing one of the monarchy's greatest secrets within reach of someone who did not play by royal rules. And doesn't hate Meghan. She simply doesn't trust what Meghan represents. A narrative-driven outsider who understands how to weaponize information. Harry always believed he understood his place in the royal family. Not the place the tabloids wrote about. Not the place online critics mocked. Not even the place Meghan reassured him he deserved. He believed, deep in his bones, that he had a fixed, permanent, unshakable role in the Queen's heart and in the monarchy's future. So when the Queen's will began to unfold that afternoon, he entered the room with a quiet confidence tucked under the anxiety he refused to acknowledge. He told himself this reading wasn't about hierarchy or punishment or favoritism. He told himself the Queen had always known the real him, the warm one, the emotional one, the honest one. He told himself he would be included in the meaningful parts because the Queen had always made him feel seen in a way the institution never did. But when Princess Anne spoke the line that gave Prince William sole guardianship of the confidential family archive, something inside Harry stopped. It wasn't a simple pause. It wasn't confusion. It was something harsher, deeper, more painful, like a rope snapping inside him after carrying too much weight for too long. Harry's reaction wasn't explosive at first. It was internal. A flash of disbelief washed across his features before he managed to contain it. His brows drew together ever so slightly, his mouth tightened, his jaw flexed. For a moment, his eyes darted to William, not out of jealousy, but confusion. Confusion so sharp it bordered on heartbreak. William didn't look back, not because he didn't feel his brother's stare, but because he already predicted this moment. He wasn't avoiding Harry out of superiority. He was avoiding him out of sadness. William had always known the Queen would make this choice. He'd felt it coming for years, in quiet conversations, in solemn meetings, in subtle lessons disguised as casual reflections. William had been trained for the archive. Harry hadn't. And the gap between them was now carved into the Queen's final, well, like a scar. Harry swallowed. It felt like swallowing glass. The rational part of him, the military-trained, disciplined part, tried to process the news logically. It's tradition, he told himself. It's structural. It's not personal. But the emotional part of him, the one that had driven most of his decisions since stepping away from the royal family, refused to submit. Why him? Why only him? Why not me? Why not both of us? The questions slapped him one by one, each harder than the last. He didn't want to show the reaction. Not in front of Anne. Not in front of William. Not in front of Meghan. But his body betrayed him. His fingers, loosely clasped together on the table, began tapping, a nervous tic that had followed him since childhood. Meghan noticed first. She touched his knee gently under the table, grounding him. But her touch didn't soothe him. It amplified the humiliation. Because now he wasn't just excluded. He was excluded in front of his wife, his brother, and the one royal figure who had always intimidated him, Princess Anne. Harry's mind spiraled back to childhood memories. The Queen smiling at him during Trooping the Color. Her warm hand squeezing his after he joked about being bored during long services. The quiet Christmas moments where she told him stories about her father. The nights at Balmoral when she listened to him speak about Diana with a softness no one else could match. Those memories painted a version of the Queen that felt incompatible with the exclusion and had just read out loud. How could the woman who doted on him, who called him my dear boy, who comforted him after his mother's death, suddenly leave him out of something so monumental? The contradiction hit him like a punch. He felt betrayed. Not by Anne, not by William, not by Meghan, but by the Queen herself. And that was the deepest wound of all. His breathing changed. Not dramatically, not the way a camera would catch, but subtly. His shoulders stiffened. His chest rose and fell a little more quickly. He pressed his tongue against the roof of his mouth to steady himself, a trick he learned during military training. But nothing could steady the storm building inside him. He glanced at Meghan again, searching for reassurance, but what he saw wasn't comfort, it was calculation. Meghan's eyes scanned the room, reading every micro-reaction, every silence, every flicker of emotion on the faces around them. She understood the political implications instantly, but Harry wasn't thinking politically. He was thinking emotionally. Personally, this wasn't a PR blow. This was a familial rejection. And that distinction created a gulf between them in that moment that neither of them acknowledged. Princess, and, meanwhile, watched Harry with the kind of quiet empathy only she could offer. Empathy without softness, concern without coddling. She had known this would hurt him. She wasn't heartless. She wasn't cold. She was disciplined. Duty first. And duty required reading the Queen's will exactly as it was written. Still, she caught the flicker of devastation crossing Harry's expression, and it hit her harder than she expected. She remembered him as the mischievous little boy who raced through palace corridors, who tried to sneak biscuits from the kitchen, who clung to Diana's side like a shadow. She remembered the lost teenager who struggled to find his place after Diana's death. She remembered the soldier who fought bravely, trying to carve meaning into a life overshadowed by the crown he'd never wear. She remembered all of it. But she also saw what the Queen saw: instability, vulnerability, impulsiveness. A heart too easily swayed by emotion and by influence. Harry felt the room closing in on him. His ears buzzed. His vision tightened. It wasn't a panic attack, but it was close. A shadow of one. The kind he learned to mask during public engagements. He felt his throat tighten, but he kept silent. He wasn't going to crack. Not here. Not now. But then Princess and turned the page. The sound of paper shifting felt like thunder in Harry's ears. He braced himself, telling his body to stay still. But the next words hit him harder than the archive decision itself. The individual entrusted must demonstrate unwavering loyalty to the institution. Harry's chest constricted. His stomach knotted. It felt like a direct accusation, a verdict on his character. His loyalty questioned, publicly, by the Queen's final instruction. Meghan's grip on his knee tightened. William's expression twitched, not in triumph, but in pain. Anne's voice remained steady as she finished the sentence, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of remorse. And must not be susceptible to external influence. Harry froze. That line landed like an explosion in the center of the room. The implication was unmistakable. The Queen wasn't just excluding him. She was explaining why. And in doing so, she was pointing to the one truth Harry refused to confront. The monarchy believed he was no longer independent. That he was guided more by emotion, resentment, and external relationships than by duty. And sitting beside him, beautiful, poised, unblinking, was the person the monarchy had silently marked as that external influence. Meghan felt the implication too. It hit her like cold water. Her spine stiffened. Her eyes narrowed. Her fingers twitched, the urge to defend herself bubbling beneath her calm exterior. But she stayed still. Meghan understood optics better than anyone in the room. Showing any reaction would confirm the implication. So she became a statue, controlled, unreadable, but burning internally. Harry wasn't burning. Harry was unraveling. He blinked several times. His mouth opened slightly as if about to speak, but no words came. He wasn't angry yet, not in the way anger usually erupts. This was quieter, more insidious, a feeling that blended humiliation, betrayal, confusion, and heartbreak into a single crushing weight. He leaned back in his chair slightly, his body reacting before his mind could process. That's when he realized something terrifying. This wasn't a misunderstanding he could clarify with the Queen. She was gone. This wasn't a conflict he could resolve through conversation. This was final, written, sealed, delivered, unchangeable. He felt suddenly disconnected from the room, from the table, from the people he once thought were his unbreakable foundation. His eyes drifted to William again, searching for some sign of solidarity, some silent reassurance that this didn't mean what he thought it meant. But William looked crushed too. Crushed because he knew his brother would take this personally. Crushed because he wished the Queen didn't have to make such distinctions. Crushed because the crown always came before family, and he had spent his entire life accepting that truth, while Harry had spent his entire life fighting it. Harry tried to swallow again, but couldn't. His throat constricted. He stared at the folder in front of Anne, as if hoping the words might rewrite themselves. But they didn't. They remained carved into the pages, carved into the air, carved into his memory. He wanted to leave the room. He wanted to stand up and walk out. He wanted to scream. He wanted to protest. He wanted to accuse someone, anyone, of twisting the Queen's intentions. But he did none of those things. Because then, and spoke again. "There is one more matter," she said. Harry's eye snapped up and reached into the folder, pulled out a smaller envelope, cream-colored, thick, sealed with wax, and placed it on the table in front of Harry with a gentleness that contradicted everything that had come before. "This letter," she said softly, "was written by the Queen specifically for you." Harry stared at it. His breath stalled. Meghan leaned closer. William's eyes dropped to the table and withdrew her hand slowly. And in that moment, Harry felt something he hadn't expected to feel at all. Fear. Because if the Queen could exclude him, what message did she feel compelled to leave him privately? And why did it look as if reading it aloud would have been too cruel? From the outside, Meghan Markle looked perfectly composed. Not a hair out of place. Not a muscle twitching. Not a flicker of panic crossing her expression. To anyone watching with an untrained eye, she appeared calm, maybe even confident. In the face of the Queen's shocking decision to exclude Harry from the confidential family archive. But composition is not the same as calm, and silence is not the same as acceptance. Because behind that immaculate exterior, Meghan's mind was in overdrive, racing, recalculating, rewriting the possible futures that had just shattered like dropped glass around her feet. Unlike Harry, who felt the emotional blow first and the implications second, Meghan processed everything in reverse. The implications hit her first. Hard, fast, brutal. And the emotional damage didn't arrive until later, only after the political consequences had been fully analyzed. Meghan wasn't just reacting as a wife. She was reacting as a strategist, a brand builder, a narrative architect, a woman who built an empire out of perception and presentation. And now she was sitting in a room where the one asset she could never control, royal legacy, had just slipped permanently out of reach. The moment Princess and read the line that William alone would inherit the archive, Meghan's eyes didn't widen. Her jaw didn't drop. Her breath didn't hitch. No, she did what people trained in Hollywood publicity do best. She locked everything down. Her entire body went still, every movement calculated to prevent the slightest hint of vulnerability from escaping. Her face became a mask, not out of coldness, but out of self-defense. Meghan knew the power of reactions. She knew and was watching, William was watching, advisors were watching. And she knew that in this environment, an environment built on hierarchy and symbolism, a single misplaced expression could be interpreted as guilt, fear, ambition, or even opportunism. She couldn't afford any of those interpretations. Not now. Not after everything she and Harry had said publicly. Not after the interviews. Not after the Netflix series. Not after the memoir. Not after the years of tension between her and the institution sitting across from her. Meghan understood instantly what Harry took several seconds to absorb. This wasn't merely an exclusion. This was a message. A deliberate one. A message that said, the monarchy does not trust you. Not with its past. Not with its secrets. Not with its unfiltered truths. And trust is everything in royal culture. Without trust, you are not just outside the inner circle. You are outside the narrative. Outside the history. Outside the future. Meghan felt that sting before Harry even processed it. And it burned. The political implications unraveled in her mind like a chain reaction. If William had sole control over the archive, he would also control the historical framing of the monarchy's most sensitive moments. He would control the story. He would control the context. He would control the legacy. And anyone who controls the past gains enormous power over the present. So what did it mean for her and Harry? It meant that their version of events, their interviews, their documentaries, their memoirs, could eventually be contradicted by documented, historical, monarch-verified truth. And if that happened, everything they had built could be undermined with one carefully curated reveal. Meghan understood that instantly. Harry did not. While he was reeling emotionally, she was calculating the long-term consequences. And that calculation sent a pulse of panic. Real panic, through her system. Not the kind that made her gasp or tremble. The kind that made her think faster, harder, sharper. Because the archive represented something far bigger than a family keepsake. It represented the only undisputed version of royal history. And the Queen had placed that version exclusively into William's hands. Meghan leaned back slightly in her chair, not enough to draw attention, just enough to observe the entire room. She watched William's reaction carefully. There was no gloating, no satisfaction, no smirk. If anything, his expression was strangely sober, almost weighted. Meghan hated that. She hated that he wasn't acting like a villain in this moment. Because if he had smirked, even a fraction, she could have framed this entire event as jealousy, spite, sibling rivalry, emotional manipulation. But he didn't. He remained still, serious, burdened. And that made the situation worse for her. A villain is easy to fight. A dutiful heir is impossible. Then she looked at Anne, princess, and the immovable pillar of royal duty. The woman Meghan could never sway, never charm, never soften. Anne's expression gave nothing away. It was calm, firm, neutral. But the neutrality was more damning than any expression of anger or judgment. Meghan recognized something in Anne's eyes: resolve, finality. The decision wasn't up for debate. The will wasn't open for reinterpretation. The Queen's instructions weren't hints. They were commands carved in stone. And Anne was there to enforce them. Meghan felt her spine stiffen, the instinctual defensive posture she adopted whenever she encountered a force she couldn't negotiate with. She wasn't afraid of Anne personally. She was afraid of what Anne represented: the Queen's unwavering judgment, the monarchy's institutional authority, the silent weight of tradition backing one unchangeable truth. And that truth was written in ink now. Not rumor, not speculation, not palace gossip. Ink. Legal. Final. And Meghan hated losing control. She had spent years mastering the art of emotional presentation, narrative positioning, and public messaging. But here, in this room, none of that mattered. Her influence meant nothing. Her skill with media meant nothing. Her ability to build sympathy meant nothing. Because the monarchy had spoken, and it had spoken through its most unshakable voice. Meghan's mind worked in layers. The first layer, immediate consequences. The second, long-term threat assessment. The third, damage control. And these layers unfolded rapidly as she realized what the Queen's decision implicitly stated about her and Harry. The statement wasn't just that they were excluded. It was that they were untrustworthy. Meghan felt a flicker of anger rise in her chest. Not the kind that lashes out, but the cold, calculating kind. Because she saw something Harry didn't. The Queen's phrasing wasn't accidental. Susceptible to external influence. A phrase crafted carefully, intentionally. A phrase that the monarchy rarely used unless referencing political vulnerability, compromised judgment, or the potential for leaks. Meghan knew exactly who the monarchy meant by external influence. She didn't need anyone to explain it. She didn't need and to clarify it. The implication was clear, sharp, and humiliating. It pointed at her. It painted her as the destabilizing force. And Meghan, the woman who built her life on redefining herself, felt cornered in a way she hadn't felt since stepping onto royal soil the first time. But she didn't let the sting reach her face. She locked it inside, behind the polished mask she learned to wear in Hollywood auditions, on red carpets, in interviews where one slip could shift an entire career. She turned her attention to Harry. Her eyes softened, not out of pity, but out of necessity, because she needed him to stay composed. She needed him to hold it together until they could leave the room. Harry looked like he'd been hit by a car. His face pale, his breathing shallow, his eyes glassy but hardening with something dangerous, humiliation turning into resentment. Meghan knew that progression well. She could see the stages forming behind his eyes. Shock, hurt, confusion, shame, anger. She needed him to stop before the last stage. Because anger in this room would destroy any hope of regaining control of the narrative later. Meghan's instincts sharpened. She brushed her hand gently against Harry's fingers, not affection, but a silent instruction: stay steady. Don't break. Don't speak. Don't give them more fuel. Harry looked at her, searching for comfort, but Meghan was not offering comfort. She was offering direction. And Harry, in that fragile moment, leaned toward direction because he had nothing else to anchor him. Then, and placed the envelope on the table. The envelope addressed to Harry. Thick paper, wax seal, personal crest, weighty, intentional. And Meghan's heart skipped, not from tenderness, but from strategy. She understood the symbolic power of a letter, especially one written by someone no longer alive. A letter from the Queen had the potential to soften the blow, or worsen it. Meghan leaned in a fraction of an inch, pretending to simply support Harry, but in reality, she was studying the envelope with surgical precision. If the Queen used a personal crest, an old one, that meant the contents were not purely emotional. It meant they were reflective, explanatory, strategic. Every symbol mattered, and Meghan suddenly felt a new fear rise within her. What if the letter contained a message that undermined everything she and Harry had said publicly? What if the Queen addressed behaviors, decisions, or dynamics Meghan wanted buried? What if the letter shifted public sympathy away from Harry and back toward the monarchy? Meghan's pulse quickened. This wasn't a simple goodbye letter. This was a powder keg.